Chapter 1. The Garden Party. It was a warm, golden afternoon in the village of St. Mary Mead. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the well-kept cottages and cobblestone streets. A slight breeze rustled the ivy hanging from the stone walls, and a scent of fresh-cut grass wafted across the village. It was one of those perfect, picturesque days that seemed to stretch on forever in rural England, until, of course, it didn't. From the ivy-clad vicarage, the cheerful sounds of voices and clinking teacups drifted into the air. Mrs. Penelope Collins, the vicar's wife, had long been known for her genteel manners and hospitality. Every summer, she hosted a garden party for the villagers, a traditional event that had grown over the years into something akin to a local institution. It was not just a social gathering, but an opportunity to raise funds for the upkeep of the church and support the local charities. The villagers looked forward to it each year, for while the event was an occasion for charity, it was also one for gossip, laughter, and the subtle exchange of secrets. Today, the garden was awash with cheerful colours. Tables were laden with delicate sandwiches, plates of scones, and bowls of fruit, while elderly women in floral dresses sipped tea from porcelain cups, exchanging pleasantries and old stories. The younger crowd, laughing and chatting, milled about in the shade of the oak trees. There were children running about, shrieking in delight as they chased one another, their feet a blur on the manicured lawn. Even the distant hum of bees seemed to be participating in the festivities as they flitted from bloom to bloom. The whole scene was a portrait of idyllic village life. At the far end of the garden stood Miss Jane Marple, observing it all with her usual quiet interest. In her thick spectacles and soft faded woolen shawl, she was the picture of genteel old age, her white hair tucked neatly into a bun, and her unassuming demeanour often led people to overlook her altogether. She was, after all, just another elderly woman with a penchant for gardening and knitting. Yet behind her gentle exterior lay an extraordinary mind, one that had spent decades keenly observing human nature. And for all the years she had spent among the villagers, Miss Marple knew that the peace of St. Mary Mead was not as solid as it appeared. She was content to stand at the margins of the group, taking in the sounds, the movements, the interplay of personalities. A sharp observer, Miss Marple understood the unspoken language of the village. The way Mrs. Barlow's tight-lipped smile always preceded an acid remark, or how Miss Violet Bennet's overly bright laugh masked a deep anxiety she rarely spoke of. Each face, each gesture told a story. And that afternoon, Miss Marple had a peculiar sense that something was amiss. Perhaps it was nothing, just an idle sense of foreboding. After all, things were as they always were. But she could not shake the feeling that under the sun-dappled surface something was quietly brewing. As she watched the guests move about, a sudden voice drew her attention. It was Mrs. Collins, the host of the gathering, standing near the front gate, speaking animatedly with Mr. Phelps, the retired solicitor. Mrs. Collins was an elegant woman in her early 60s, her dark hair streaked with silver but still styled to perfection. Her dress was a delicate shade of lavender, and she was holding her cup of tea with a certain practised poise, as if she were participating in an elaborate dance with propriety. "Everything looks wonderful, Penelope," Mr. Phelps said, nodding approvingly at the spread on the tables. You truly have a gift for this sort of thing." "Oh, it's nothing really," Mrs. Collins replied with a warm smile, though her eyes flicked nervously toward the house behind them. "It's my husband's doing, really. Gerald insists on everything being perfect. Of course, it does help that he's so good at managing the accounts. I can never keep track of it all myself." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. It wasn't the mention of Gerald Collins, the vicar of the village, that caught her attention. It was the slight tremor in Mrs. Collins's voice, the brief shift of her gaze, as if seeking reassurance from the house. It was so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but Miss Marple did. A fleeting sense of unease crept into her thoughts. She had seen such behaviour before, when someone was avoiding a particular topic, or perhaps when they were unsure of the events yet to unfold. But before Miss Marple could ponder it further, a sudden scream shattered the tranquil atmosphere. It was sharp, piercing, and full of distress. The sound cut through the conversations, causing several of the guests to pause mid-sentence, their eyes darting around the garden in search of its source. For a brief moment, the entire gathering seemed to freeze, each person holding their breath. It was Mrs. Collins who reacted first. Her face drained of colour, and she dropped her teacup with a sharp clink, the porcelain shattering on the cobblestone path. "Gerald!" she gasped, her voice full of panic. She turned toward the house as if expecting her husband to come running out, but there was no sign of him. The garden, once filled with the soft hum of conversation, was now wrapped in an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional sound of nervous shuffling. Miss Marple, however, was already moving. With quiet urgency, she made her way toward the back of the garden, her small figure cutting through the crowd of startled villagers. Her steps were steady, purposeful, though no one took much notice of her. It wasn't that Miss Marple had no presence, she was, after all, well known in the village, but rather that her unassuming appearance often caused others to forget that she had an uncanny ability to solve mysteries. She was too polite to make herself the centre of attention, yet when it came to unravelling the tangled threads of human behaviour, she was unmatched. The scream had come from the area near the back gate of the vicarage garden, where ivy-clad stone walls met the overgrown hedgerow. It was a secluded spot, far from the rest of the party-goers, where the scent of flowers mingled with the scent of damp earth. As Miss Marple reached the back gate, her keen eyes scanned the area with practised precision. There, in the shadows cast by the low stone wall, was the body of a man. Mr. Gerald Collins, the vicar, lay motionless on the ground, his face turned upward toward the sky. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the heavens, and his mouth was slightly agape, as though he had died in the middle of speaking. A small pool of blood had gathered around his head, staining the soft grass beneath him. His left hand was outstretched, as though he had tried to reach something or perhaps someone in his final moments. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her hands gentle but methodical. The garden, which had been so full of life just moments ago, was now eerily still. The party guests had gathered behind her, some of them gasping in shock, others muttering softly among themselves. Mrs. Collins had fainted and was being attended to by Mrs. Phelps, while Mr. Phelps himself stood by, wringing his hands in disbelief. "Someone should fetch the police," Miss Marple said calmly, rising from her crouch. Her voice was even. but the sharpness in her eyes revealed the gravity of the situation. "I believe the vicar has met with an untimely end." As she spoke, her gaze flickered down to the ground near Mr. Collins's outstretched hand. Something small and metallic glinted in the grass, partially hidden beneath a fallen branch. Without hesitation, Miss Marple reached down and picked it up. It was a pocket watch, its face cracked, the hands frozen at precisely 3:15. Turning it over, she saw the inscription, "To Gerald, with deepest affection, from your loving sister, Edith." The watch was not a mere trinket. It was a clue, an object that suggested a deeper story hidden beneath the surface. But what that story was, Miss Marple could not yet say. Her fingers closed gently around the watch, and she slipped it into the pocket of her shawl. "I think it's time we spoke with the police," she said, her voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "But first, I would recommend that everyone remains here. There are questions to be asked, and I believe the answers lie within this very garden." The guests nodded slowly, their faces pale and tense. No one dared to speak, yet all felt the air of suspicion hanging over them like a thick fog. The tranquillity of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. Miss Marple glanced back at the group, her expression serene as ever. Her mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. There was much more to this than a simple accident. This was no fall, no chance misstep. There was something far darker at play. As the police were summoned, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the garden, her eyes still focused on the body of the vicar. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been irrevocably changed in a matter of moments, and Miss Marple knew that the first whispers of the truth were just beginning to stir. Part 2. The Village Reacts. The moment the local constable, Sergeant Stone, arrived at the vicarage, the air grew thick with nervous tension. The sun, once bright and cheery, seemed to lose its warmth as the villagers gathered in hushed groups, their voices low and anxious. Despite the apparent civility of the gathering, the murder of Gerald Collins had turned their world upside down, and as the constable began his preliminary investigation, it became clear that no one in the village was untouched by the tragedy. Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, observing everything with her usual, almost imperceptible scrutiny. Her sharp eyes took in every detail, the tight grip on hands, the nervous glances exchanged between certain individuals, the way the women clutched their shawls or fluttered their fans in an effort to maintain some semblance of composure. She had seen it all before. These were the same telltale signs she had observed in dozens of small-town villages, in dozens of cases. And yet she never grew tired of the subtle nuances of human behaviour. Sergeant Stone, a tall man in his early 40s, with the air of someone who had seen far too much but spoke little of it, took charge immediately. He was competent, no nonsense, and not easily rattled. But Miss Marple knew he lacked the depth of insight into human nature that she possessed. Stone's approach was methodical, if not entirely dispassionate. He immediately turned to the gathered villagers, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "Please, everyone remain calm," he said, his voice deep but steady. "We are conducting an investigation, and no one is to leave until we have spoken to each of you." At his signal, 2 uniformed officers began to take statements from the guests. Mrs. Collins, who had regained consciousness, was sitting in the shade, supported by a concerned Mrs. Phelps. She appeared dazed, as though still struggling to understand the enormity of the situation. Her face was pale, her usually impeccable appearance slightly dishevelled, and there was a tremor in her hands as she gripped her lace handkerchief. "I don't understand," Mrs. Collins whispered repeatedly, her voice barely audible. "Gerald was so healthy. He was a good man. Who would do such a thing?" Her words were met with an uneasy silence, as no one had an immediate answer. The vicar's death seemed almost incomprehensible in the context of this peaceful village, where everyone knew everyone, and everyone's business seemed to be on open display. And yet it was that very familiarity, that closeness, that Miss Marple understood often masked the deepest secrets. Sergeant Stone moved toward Mrs. Collins, his large frame casting a shadow over her small form. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Collins, we'll need to ask you a few questions. I know this is a difficult time, but anything you can recall might help us understand what happened." Mrs. Collins nodded, her brow furrowing as though struggling to gather her thoughts. "Gerald, he was in the garden just moments before. He was supposed to join the party. She paused, her lips quivering. "I don't know what happened. I turned away for only a moment. When I heard the scream, I ran, and then I saw him." "Did you see anyone else in the garden before that?" Sergeant Stone asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Mrs. Collins shook her head, her lips pressed together. "No, not that I can recall, but I didn't see anyone there either. It was too sudden." Sergeant Stone glanced back at the gathered crowd, his sharp gaze lingering on certain individuals. "We'll need to speak with everyone. Please stay where you are," he said before turning to the officers nearby. "Take statements from the rest of the guests. Let's see if we can piece this together." The constable's words set the wheels of speculation into motion. As Miss Marple watched, the villagers' conversations began to ripple and multiply, each one adding another layer of uncertainty to the situation. The gossip flowed like a quiet river, as each person offered their own theory, weaving a complex web of ideas that was as intricate as it was flawed. In the midst of the growing murmur, Miss Marple's attention shifted toward a pair of figures standing just behind the crowd. It was Mr. Phelps, the retired solicitor, and his wife, Miss Violet Bennet. The two were standing in an odd formation, as though they had been drawn together by some unspoken understanding. Miss Bennet, with her frail figure and always two sharp eyes, was clutching her fan tightly, her knuckles pale as she held it up to her face. Her eyes darted around nervously, clearly uncomfortable in the thickening atmosphere of suspicion. Mr. Phelps, on the other hand, appeared far more composed. His usual jovial demeanour had been replaced by a more sombre, businesslike air. He was tall with a solid build, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a note of authority. He was a man used to navigating the complex world of law and business. But Miss Marple noticed that his normally open features were now taut with tension. "Did you notice anything unusual during the party?" Miss Marple asked, her voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. Both Phelps and Bennet turned toward her, their faces unreadable for a moment. Phelps smiled, albeit with a tight-lipped expression. "Oh, nothing out of the ordinary, Miss Marple. Just the usual light-hearted gossip, you know. We've all seen a few garden parties in our time. The usual talk about the weather, the local news, the latest trends. But Miss Marple, ever so perceptive, caught a glimmer of unease in Phelps's eyes. He was trying too hard to appear nonchalant, and it was that very effort that made her wonder. Why was he avoiding a more direct response? "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone unassuming but sharp. "And Miss Bennet? Did you see anything unusual?" Miss Bennet hesitated, her fan trembling in her hand. I don't know, Miss Marple. There's nothing I can recall. I was just watching the others, as one does. Perhaps it was all just too sudden." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her expression thoughtful. "The suddenness of it all certainly leaves little time for clarity. Well, I won't keep you. Perhaps later, if you think of anything else." Both nodded, though Miss Marple noticed a slight exchange of glances between them. That was all it took, just a glance, yet it spoke volumes. She had learned long ago to trust the smallest of clues. This moment would be one to remember. As the afternoon wore on, more villagers were questioned, and the initial shock of the event began to dissipate, replaced by something far more dangerous: suspicion. Each person's statement, it seemed, only added more questions, more inconsistencies. The stories began to weave and tangle in contradictory ways. Some claimed they had heard the scream, but none could pinpoint its exact location or the timing. Others were adamant that they had seen nothing unusual at all. Yet there was one common thread running through all the statements: the name of a woman, Edith Collins, Gerald's younger sister. Edith had been conspicuously absent from the garden, yet no one seemed to know where she had gone. Some claimed she had left early. Others suggested she had been in the house. The mystery of her whereabouts had begun to occupy the minds of the villagers, and though Miss Marple did not yet voice her suspicions, she knew that this woman would play a crucial role in the unravelling of the truth. The afternoon sun finally began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the vicarage garden. The constables were still taking statements, and Sergeant Stone was beginning to look more and more weary. But Miss Marple was just getting started. She was not one to make quick judgments, and she had learned long ago to let the pieces of the puzzle fall into place at their own pace. As the last of the villagers made their way home, Miss Marple stood for a moment in the garden, gazing at the quiet scene. The once bustling party was now a thing of the past, replaced by the stark reality of a murder that had shattered the calm of this quaint village. Turning, Miss Marple slowly made her way back to her cottage. The sun was setting, but the mysteries of the day were only just beginning to unfold. Part 3. Early Investigation. The evening had fallen over St. Mary's, and the village, usually so vibrant with evening gossip and local chatter, was now muted, as if the very air had become thick with uncertainty. The murder of Gerald Collins hung over everything like a dark cloud, casting long shadows over familiar streets and homes. The people of St. Mary's had always prided themselves on their peaceful existence, their small-town lives a haven from the chaos of the larger world. Now, that illusion had been shattered. Miss Marple, having returned to her cottage, sat in her favourite chair by the fire, a cup of tea cooling slowly in her hands. The low crackle of the flames was a familiar comfort, but it did little to ease the restlessness that had settled in her chest. She had not expected the murder, of course, but she had seen it coming in some way. She had long understood that beneath the surface of every seemingly tranquil community, there were hidden currents of resentment, jealousy, and unspoken grievances. It was those very currents that often led to tragedy. She had spent the better part of the afternoon observing, listening, and considering the information she had gathered. She knew better than to make rash judgments based on first impressions, but there were already certain patterns she could begin to discern. The connections between the villagers were becoming clearer, and with each passing moment, the mystery seemed more complex, more layered. At precisely 6 o'clock, Miss Marple's quiet contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at her door. She rose and opened it to find Sergeant Stone, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he greeted her, his tone polite but weary. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Sergeant," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Please, come in. You look tired. Have you been questioning the villagers all day?" Stone nodded, his eyes darkening as he crossed the threshold. "I have indeed. It's been a long day, but I think we're starting to piece things together, slowly." He sighed, a weary sound, and took a seat across from her. "I must say, Miss Marple, this case is proving more difficult than I expected." Miss Marple smiled softly, settling back into her chair. "I'm sure it is. It's rarely the simple things that leave a lasting impression." Stone gave a brief, rueful chuckle. "That's certainly true. I've been speaking with the Collins family, of course. Mrs. Collins is, well, understandably upset. She's still quite shaken. I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to get out of her." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "She's likely in shock. When someone is that close to the victim, their own emotions can cloud their perception of events. But I'm sure we'll hear more as time passes." Stone's eyes narrowed slightly. "There's something else, though. Something that doesn't add up." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Edith Collins, the victim's sister. I don't think she's telling us the whole truth." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "What makes you say that?" "Well," Stone began, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest, "she was one of the last to see Gerald alive. She claims she went to the house to fetch a book, but no one saw her leave the garden. She says she was in the drawing room for the entire time the murder occurred, but I'm not so sure. We haven't been able to verify her alibi." "And what about the others?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild but with an undercurrent of keen interest. Stone hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "There's also the matter of Mr. Phelps. I'm not saying he's guilty, but there's something about him that doesn't sit right. He was too eager to deflect questions today. I had a few words with him, and he seemed, well, almost too calm, if you ask me." Miss Marple considered this. "Yes, I did notice his manner this afternoon. He certainly seemed less perturbed by the event than one might expect." Stone sighed again, clearly frustrated. "I don't know. It's all very confusing. The villagers are all gossiping, offering up their theories, but none of it makes any sense. I think we need more concrete evidence. A weapon, a witness, anything that could point us in the right direction." Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes flicking thoughtfully to the fire. "You're right, Sergeant. But sometimes, you know, the answers don't come from the evidence. They come from understanding people, their behaviour, their habits, the things they say, or don't say." Stone stared at her, clearly intrigued by her words. "What do you mean?" "Let's look at it this way," Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly. "Everyone has something to hide. Every villager, no matter how seemingly innocuous, has secrets, things they would rather keep buried. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone is guilty of murder outright, but I do believe the answers lie in the behaviour of the people involved. You must observe them closely." Stone looked unconvinced, but Miss Marple's calm certainty seemed to strike a chord with him. He sat back, crossing his arms, and waited for her to continue. "There is one thing I've noticed," Miss Marple said slowly. "The Collins family, the ones closest to the victim, they're all under intense pressure. But then there's something else. The villagers speak of Gerald as if he were, well, something of an outsider, and yet he was a well-liked vicar, respected in the community. I wonder, did he have any enemies?" Stone shook his head. "That's the odd thing, Miss Marple. No one seems to have any particular animosity toward him. He was well-liked, like you said. But there were whispers, small things, insignificant things, really, about him becoming involved with a local charity in a way that made some of the older residents uncomfortable. A little too much attention to certain causes, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. A man of the cloth, perhaps too progressive for his own good. Stone nodded, his face grave. "Perhaps. But I think we need to dig deeper. It's a delicate subject. If there's any truth to these rumours, we'll need to tread carefully." Miss Marple sat back, contemplating. "Indeed, but for now, I would recommend we focus on Edith Collins. She seems to have vanished from everyone's radar after the murder, and that is something worth investigating." Sergeant Stone nodded. "I'll follow up with her. But Miss Marple, I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this than just family secrets and small-town resentments." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with an almost imperceptible gleam. "Oh, I have no doubt, Sergeant. There is always more to every story. The question is, can we see it?" Stone stood shaking his head with a wry smile. "I'll do my best. We'll talk again tomorrow." "Of course," Miss Marple said, rising to show him out. "Good night, Sergeant." As the door clicked shut behind him, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The clues were there. She just had to wait for the right moment to bring them all into focus. Game had begun, and Miss Marple had only just begun to play her part. Part 4. Secrets Unveiled. The morning light streamed through the small lace-curtained windows of Miss Marple's cottage, casting soft golden hues across the room. The village of St. Mary's was still quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of a passing carriage. But beneath the calm exterior, something was shifting. The threads of the mystery were beginning to weave together, and Miss Marple could feel it. The moment of revelation was fast approaching. She had spent the morning revisiting the places and people she had observed the day before. As she walked through the village square, she couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the way people were looking at one another. It was as if the murder had altered the very fabric of their interactions. Conversations were more hushed, glances more wary. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the tiniest of shifts, hands that trembled just slightly, eyes that darted away when a name was mentioned. The village had been unsettled, and though many tried to maintain their usual composure, the tension was palpable. It was just after noon when Sergeant Stone arrived at Miss Marple's cottage once again, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp with resolve. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as though the pressing nature of his news could no longer be contained. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and serious, "I think we're closer than we were yesterday." Miss Marple looked up from her chair, her interest piqued. "Oh, please, do sit down and tell me what you've discovered, Sergeant." Stone took a seat across from her, setting a small leather-bound notebook on the table between them. "It's Edith Collins," he began. "She's been hiding something important. I don't think she's directly involved in the murder, but there's definitely more to her story than she's letting on." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, though her mind was already racing. "What did you find?" Stone exhaled, a mixture of frustration and determination in his eyes. "I've been back to the Collins house, and I spoke again with Edith. She finally admitted that the night Gerald was killed, she was not alone in the house, as she'd previously stated. She had a visitor, someone she's been seeing in secret, a man named Richard Carlyle. I didn't get a chance to speak with him directly, but the tension between them was, well, it was palpable." Miss Marple sat forward, her interest piqued even further. "Richard Carlyle, you say? A secret lover, perhaps?" Stone nodded. "That's what it seems. But there's something else, Miss Marple. Richard Carlyle isn't just anyone. He's connected to a group of people, a few of them from out of town, who are involved in some shady business. Nothing illegal, at least not in any obvious way. But the connections are concerning. He's been involved in several investments, none of which seem to be above board. And he's been in the village under a false name." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "A false name? How very curious. Tell me more." Stone opened his notebook and began flipping through the pages. "I checked the local records. No one by the name of Richard Carlyle had ever lived here. But there was a man by the name of James Pritchard, a name Edith had mentioned once in passing, as an old acquaintance. The records show that Pritchard arrived in the village about 6 months ago and made a rather large investment in a property near the Collins home. The man had been known in other places, though not for anything good. He's been associated with several failed business ventures, some of which were rumoured to be cover-ups for more dubious activities." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "So, it seems we have a connection to something larger than just a domestic affair. Richard Carlyle, or James Pritchard, wasn't just a lover. He had a stake in the village's affairs." Stone nodded grimly. "That's what I'm starting to believe. And Edith Collins is more deeply involved in his world than anyone realized. She's been keeping her distance from the rest of the family, avoiding contact with them after Gerald's death, and I think it's because she knows something she doesn't want to share." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her mind working swiftly to piece together the implications of this new information. "Tell me, Sergeant," she said finally, "do you know if anyone else in the village might have known about Edith's relationship with this Richard Carlyle?" Stone shook his head. "I'm not sure yet. I've asked around, but no one has admitted to knowing much. There have been rumours, of course, people whispering about the Collins family for months, but nothing concrete. It's all been kept very quiet." Miss Marple stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the village square. Her eyes were distant, as though she were seeing beyond the present moment, imagining the various ways the villagers' lives might have intersected with the tragedy. She had learned long ago that everyone had a secret to hide, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, and it was often those very secrets that led to tragedy. Turning back to Stone, she spoke with quiet authority. "We need to keep an eye on Edith Collins. She's at the centre of this, even if she doesn't realise it yet. But there's more to her story, something she's afraid to confront. I suspect her connection to Mr. Carlyle is more than just a romantic entanglement." Stone's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe Edith Collins knows more about Gerald's death than she's letting on. And I also believe she's being manipulated by Mr. Carlyle. He's a man with a past, and I don't think he's as innocent as he appears." Stone stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can find out about him. But, Miss Marple, how do you think we should proceed with Edith?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "We continue to watch, Sergeant. Watch carefully. People like Edith are often the hardest to read, but they're also the most revealing when their masks begin to crack. If we can get to the truth, it will be because she lets it slip. But for now, we stay patient." Stone rose to leave, but paused at the door, turning back to Miss Marple. "You're sure about this?" Miss Marple's smile deepened. "In matters of the heart, Sergeant, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. People's emotions tend to betray them when they're under pressure." Stone gave a thoughtful nod before stepping out, leaving Miss Marple to her own quiet musings. As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple resumed her place by the fire, the embers glowing faintly. She could feel the puzzle pieces shifting once more. Edith Collins and Richard Carlyle were at the heart of this mystery, but the true nature of their involvement was still hidden beneath layers of fear, shame, and secrecy. Miss Marple had no doubt she would uncover the truth. She always did. But first, she would have to wait for the moment when the truth would finally reveal itself. And she was willing to wait. And Part 5, A New Crime, A New Revelation. The days following Sergeant Stone's visit passed in a strange quiet. The village of St. Mary's, though still reeling from Gerald Collins's murder, began to settle back into its ordinary rhythm. The village square became busier with the usual hustle and bustle of market days, but there was a subtle undercurrent of tension in the air. The murder had unsettled people, causing a ripple of unease that had yet to subside. And as Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, she could sense that beneath the surface, the villagers were changing. It was on a Tuesday morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, that the next twist in the case emerged. Miss Marple had just finished her breakfast, a simple cup of tea and a slice of toast, when there came a sharp knock at her door. The sound was brisk and authoritative, unmistakable in its urgency. She rose from her chair and opened the door to find Sergeant Stone standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and concern. "Miss Marple," he said quickly, his voice almost shaking, "there's been another crime, another murder." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she did not show it. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, as though this was simply another piece of the puzzle to be put into place. Another murder? Here in the village? Stone nodded. Yes, it's Mrs. Rachel Archer, the widow who lives near the mill. Her body was found early this morning in her garden. It looks like she was strangled. No sign of struggle, no theft. Just like Gerald Collins, it seems like the killer came and went without leaving a trace. Miss Marple's mind immediately began to churn. 2 murders, so close together, with similar circumstances. The method of the crime was chillingly similar. Both victims were killed quietly, swiftly, without any signs of a struggle. There was something deliberate about the way the murders were carried out, as though the killer knew exactly what they were doing. "Did you find anything unusual at the scene, Sergeant?" Miss Marple asked, her tone measured, betraying none of her inner thoughts. Stone hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that's the odd part. There was something strange. A flower, a single red rose, left on Mrs. Archer's doorstep. And it was placed so carefully, so deliberately, that it almost felt like a message." Miss Marple's eyes lit up with quiet interest. "A message? How intriguing." "It's not much, Miss Marple," Stone continued, "but it stood out. No one can explain it. Mrs. Archer had no connection to the Collins family, no apparent enemies. There's no obvious reason why she'd be targeted, but someone clearly wanted to send a message." Miss Marple thought for a moment, her gaze drifting to the window, where the village seemed to carry on as usual. The sun was rising, higher now, and the morning fog was starting to lift, revealing the familiar sights of the peaceful village. But to Miss Marple, it all felt hollow, as though the village itself were holding its breath. "I will come with you, Sergeant," she said quietly. "Let me see the scene for myself. Perhaps there is something that has been overlooked, without—" Another word. Miss Marple grabbed her shawl and followed Stone out of the cottage. The morning air was crisp, and the path to Mrs. Archer's house was bathed in a soft golden light. The village appeared almost serene, but Miss Marple could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her. She could sense that something was changing, something that could not be ignored. When they arrived at Mrs. Archer's house, the scene was eerily calm. The small cottage sat at the edge of the village, its well-kept garden bursting with flowers. The neatness of the yard only served to underscore the horror of the crime that had taken place here. Stone led her through the gate and into the garden, where the body had been found. The first thing Miss Marple noticed was the complete lack of any signs of struggle. Mrs. Archer's body had been carefully positioned, as though the killer had taken their time. She was lying in the grass, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as though she were merely sleeping. There was no blood, no signs of injury, other than the marks around her neck, where the life had been squeezed out of her secret. Second thing Miss Marple noticed was the red rose delicately placed on the doorstep. It stood out in the otherwise tidy garden, its deep crimson colour almost glowing in the sunlight. Whoever had left it there had done so with great care. Stone was speaking to a constable nearby, but Miss Marple barely heard him. She was focused on the rose, on the delicate, fragile nature of it. It was a symbol, that much was clear. A symbol of something deeper, something tied to both the previous murder and this one. But what? Miss Marple crouched down beside the rose, her eyes scanning, the petals with a practised gaze. There was nothing unusual about the flower itself, no hidden messages or signs to be found. It was simply a rose. But the placement of it, it was too deliberate to be accidental. "Sergeant," Miss Marple said quietly, standing up, "I believe the killer is sending us a message." Stone looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "A message? What do you mean?" "The red rose," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's not just a random act. It's a deliberate symbol. A symbol of passion, of love, but also of violence. It's almost as though the killer is trying to draw some kind of connection between the two murders." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "We need to understand the significance of this rose. It might tell us who the killer is, or at least give us an insight into their mind." Stone seemed to digest this for a moment, but then he shook his head. "I'm not sure, Miss Marple. There's no connection between Mrs. Archer and the Collins family. No obvious motive for her murder." Miss Marple smiled faintly. But that is the mistake everyone is making, Sergeant. The connection is not between the victims. It's between the killer and the victims. The killer is sending us a message, and I believe that message is linked to something that happened long before either of these murders." Stone stared at her, his confusion still evident, but he said nothing further. Miss Marple could see that he was beginning to grasp the enormity of what she was suggesting, that these murders were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, carefully orchestrated plan. As Miss Marple stood there, her mind racing through the possibilities, she realized that the key to solving this mystery would lie not in the obvious clues, like the rose or the method of the killings, but in the hidden connections between the people involved, and that was where she would find the truth. "Come, Sergeant," she said softly, turning away from the scene. "There is much more to uncover, and I have a feeling we are only just beginning to see the whole picture." As they walked back, down the garden path, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled with new theories and possibilities. The mystery was far from over, but she was closer now than ever before. The killer had made a mistake, left a trail of clues for her to follow, and she would not rest until she had unravelled the truth. The game, as always, was afoot. Part 6. Secrets. Unfolding in the shadows. The days that followed Mrs. Archer's death were filled with a sense of mounting tension in the village. Though life continued on its usual path, market stalls filled with fresh vegetables, children running through the village square, shopkeepers exchanging pleasantries, the murder had left an indelible mark on the community. There was a change in the air, a shift in the way people moved and spoke. Conversations that once flowed easily became more strained, as if everyone had a secret they were trying desperately to hide. Sergeant Stone, ever diligent but clearly frustrated by the lack of progress, had begun to take a more visible role in the investigation. He and his team combed through the village, interviewing anyone who might have seen something unusual the night before Mrs. Archer's body was found. However, like the first murder, there were no answers, only more questions. Pstooth, Marple, as always, remained a quiet observer of the village's activities. She had seen it all before, this reaction to tragedy. The gossip, the half-hearted suspicions, the constant search for a reason where none existed. Yet, in the midst of this turmoil, she continued to observe and listen. Each conversation she overheard, each passing glance, each fleeting word of gossip, was like a puzzle piece waiting to be slotted into place. On the morning after Mrs. Archer's funeral, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage garden again. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting a golden hue over the flowerbeds. She had made a habit of visiting the garden each day, not for any particular reason, but because it felt like a place where the answers might reveal themselves. As she passed through the iron gate, Miss Marple was greeted by the sight of Vicar Henry Price, who was trimming the hedges at the far end of the garden. He was an unremarkable man in his 50s, tall, thin, with a perpetually anxious expression, as though he were always on the edge of some crisis. Despite his gentle demeanour, Miss Marple had always found something unnerving about him. He had been the one to find Mrs. Archer's body the morning it was discovered, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his involvement in the case than he had let on. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Vicar Price called out as he saw her approach, a strange smile on his face. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Quite," Miss Marple replied, her voice light, but her eyes sharp as she studied the vicar. "I trust you are keeping well?" "Oh, yes. Just keeping busy with the usual duties. The village, you know, always something that needs tending, too." He wiped his brow with a handkerchief, clearly attempting to make small talk. "I suppose you've heard the news about Mrs. Archer. Such a tragedy." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. She could see that the vicar was uneasy, his gaze darting to the side, and then quickly averting back to her. He was hiding something. She was certain of it. "But what?" "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "It must have been a shock, too. Find her. I imagine it's been hard on the villagers. There's something about death that seems to linger in the air, don't you think?" The vicar stiffened slightly at her words, but then quickly regained his composure. "Quite," he muttered. "Quite." Miss Marple studied the vicar for a moment longer, then decided to change the subject. "Tell me, Henry," she began, her tone casual, "has there been any word on the police investigation? They must be making progress, surely." "Progress?" The vicar seemed to snap out of his daze, and his face turned pale. "Well, they're doing their best, I'm sure. I imagine they'll get to the bottom of it soon enough." Miss Marple observed him closely, noting the nervous shift in his stance. His answer had been too quick, too defensive. It was clear that the vicar was feeling the pressure of the investigation, and perhaps even the weight of his own conscience. "Sure they will," Miss Marple said with a soft smile, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I do hope they're not overlooking anything important." Vicar Price's eyes flickered, and for just a moment Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something darker beneath the surface. But before she could press him further, a shout from the other end of the garden interrupted their conversation. "Vicar! Vicar! You need to come quickly!" It was Constable Hawkes, a tall man with broad shoulders and a no-nonsense demeanour. He had been patrolling the village and had clearly found something of interest. "Forgive me, Miss Marple," the vicar said hurriedly, his expression now betraying genuine concern. "I must see what's happened." Miss Marple nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Of course, Henry. I'll leave you to it." As the vicar hurried off toward Constable Hawkes, Miss Marple lingered by the gate for a moment, watching them. She could feel a familiar stir of suspicion in her gut. There was something going on here, something that wasn't being said. The vicar's nervousness, the way he seemed to avoid her gaze, the odd defensiveness in his voice. It all pointed to one thing. He was hiding something. But what? Miss Marple turned away, her mind already working through the possibilities. She had seen this behaviour before, though never with quite as much urgency. It wasn't just fear. It was the kind of anxiety that came when someone knew they were about to be caught. But caught for what? She had no answers yet, but she was certain that the vicar had some part to play in this mystery. As she made her way back to her cottage, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The vicar was only one piece of the puzzle, and though he had piqued her curiosity, she had more important matters to attend to. She had spent enough time watching people and listening to their secrets. Now it was time to put all of it together. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple sat down at her writing desk, pulling out a sheet of paper and a pen. It was time to make a list, she decided. A list of everyone who might be involved in these two murders. She would look for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might tie the victims together. The rows, the method of killing, the victims themselves. There had to be a link, something deeper than mere coincidence, and as she wrote, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that she was closing in on something significant. She was beginning to see the web that connected them all. And though it was still unclear, one thing was certain. The killer was growing bolder. With each passing day, the mystery was becoming clearer, and so was the danger. As the light from the setting sun filtered through her window, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, a quiet resolve settling in her heart. She was on the right track. The killer would make a mistake. They always did. It was just a matter of time before Miss Marple caught them in their lie, and when that moment came, the truth would be revealed. Part 7. The Web Tightens. The morning sun rose over the village, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The peaceful rhythm of daily life continued, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of fear, as though the village was holding its breath. The air felt thicker, the silence more oppressive. Miss Marple, as always, was an observer, her sharp eyes noting every nuance, every subtle shift in the behaviour of those around her. By now, the investigation had drawn the attention of several outside authorities, but the village's tight-knit community still looked to its own for answers. Sergeant Stone's team had expanded, and Constable Hawkes had been assigned to follow up on the few leads that had surfaced. Yet despite all their efforts, the mystery surrounding Mrs. Archer's death, and now the murder of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, remained unsolved. In the days following the second murder, Miss Marple had noticed an increase in activity at the vicarage. Vicar Price, now visibly shaken and even more withdrawn, was frequently seen in hurried conversations with Constable Hawkes. The weight of suspicion had already begun to fall on him, as it was clear that his wife's death followed the same pattern as Mrs. Archer's. A rose left at the scene, a similar method of strangulation. There were too many parallels to ignore. It wasn't just the vicar's nervous behaviour that had raised Miss Marple's suspicions. There were others whose reactions seemed to hint at knowledge they were unwilling to share. The village had its secrets, and Miss Marple had made it her business to uncover them. That afternoon, as Miss Marple made her way down the familiar path to the village square, she was joined by the steady figure of Constable Hawkes. His demeanour was always businesslike, but today there was a certain weariness in his eyes that Miss Marple didn't miss. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Quite the day for a walk, isn't it?" "Yes, indeed," she replied, her tone casual. She had a feeling that something important was about to unfold. "I've been thinking about the recent events. The murders, I mean." "Ah!" Constable Hawkes sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had fallen on him. "It's a mess, Miss Marple. A bloody mess. The vicar, he's been acting strange, you know. Even for him. I've been keeping an eye on him, but he's not the type to open up. And the more I watch him, the more I get the sense that there's something he's hiding." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, a slight smile touching her lips. "Indeed, I've been watching him too. There's something about his behaviour that doesn't quite sit right. But then again, people often act strangely in the face of tragedy. Do you think he's involved?" "I don't know," Constable Hawkes admitted, his tone low. "I keep hoping I'll find something that will clear him, but I don't trust the way he's been dodging my questions. It's almost like he knows more than he's letting on." He paused for a moment, glancing around the square. "I'm not the only one who feels this way. A few of the villagers are starting to talk." "I would imagine they are," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Gossip always thrives in times of tragedy. It's a curious thing, how quickly people begin to cast suspicion. But I wonder, Constable, if there's more to these murders than just the vicar's wife. I've been thinking that perhaps Mrs. Archer's death wasn't as random as it seemed." "Random?" Constable Hawkes looked at her sharply. "You think it's connected to Mrs. Price's murder?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I do. There are too many similarities. The method of killing, the placement of the rose, and the fact that both victims were prominent figures in the village. It feels deliberate, as though someone wanted to send a message. But who?" Hawkes seemed to consider this for a moment, his brow furrowing. The vicar's wife wasn't involved in any sort of public work like Mrs. Archer. She wasn't the same type of person. "That may be true," Miss Marple replied, "but it's possible that Mrs. Price knew something she wasn't supposed to. Or perhaps someone wanted to punish the vicar through her. That's a common motive when it comes to revenge." "Revenge?" Hawkes repeated, his voice tinged with surprise. "You think the murders are personal?" "I do, and that's why I believe we must look deeper into the relationships between these people. Think about it. Mrs. Archer was no stranger to controversy. She had connections with some rather unsavoury individuals. But the vicar's wife, well, she was just a quiet woman, devoted to her husband and to the church. Yet her death followed, the same pattern as Mrs. Archer's. It's as though someone was trying to make a statement." Constable Hawkes shifted uneasily. "But who could have done such a thing? And why? That's what we need to figure out," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "There's something at the heart of this, something that no one has dared to speak of, but I have a feeling we're getting closer." As they walked on, the two of them fell into a contemplative silence. The village square was quieter than usual, with most of the townspeople staying indoors to avoid the growing tension. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the large oak tree in the centre of the square. its gnarled branches reaching high into the sky. Beneath that tree, she thought, many secrets had been buried. By the time they reached the edge of the square, Miss Marple's mind was racing. She had one more stop to make before the day was through. The vicarage. Though she had her suspicions, she knew better than to act hastily. This case wasn't just about finding a killer. It was about uncovering a deeper truth, and if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned over the years, it was that the truth had a way of revealing itself at the most unexpected moments. As she walked away from Constable Hawkes, she couldn't help but feel that something significant was just around the corner. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and soon Miss Marple would have the answers she had been seeking all along. But the killer was still out there, and with each passing day, the danger grew. Part 8. The Vicar's Confession. The following day, Miss Marple found herself standing at the wrought-iron gate of the vicarage, the very same gate she had passed countless times before. The village was quieter now, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. The murders had cast a long shadow over the community, and though many were too frightened to speak of it, Miss Marple could sense that the villagers were desperate for answers. She too was hungry for the truth, but in her mind the truth could only be found through patience, observation, and an understanding of the people who lived in the village. The vicarage itself was a small stone building, its ivy-covered walls standing as a quiet sentinel at the heart of the village. The garden, usually well maintained, was now untidy, wildflowers growing unkempt in places where there had once been neat rows. The vicar's unease, it seemed, had translated into neglect of his duties as a caretaker. As Miss Marple walked along the gravel path, her thoughts were filled with the questions that still lingered from her last conversation with Constable Hawkes. Why had the murders followed such a similar pattern? And why were two women who seemed so different tied together by such a brutal act? The door to the vicarage creaked open as she reached it, and there stood Vicar Henry Price, his face pale and drawn, as though he had not slept for days. His eyes darted around, and for a moment he hesitated before greeting her. "Miss Marple," he said in a strained voice. "What brings you here today?" "I've come for a chat, Henry," Miss Marple replied gently, offering him a warm, disarming smile. "I've been thinking a lot about the recent events in the village, and I believe you might have something to tell me." Vicar Price's face tightened at her words, and he quickly looked down, avoiding her gaze. There was a moment of hesitation, and then he stepped aside, opening the door wider to let her in. "Please, come in," he muttered. "It's not often I have visitors these days." Inside, the vicarage was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of old books and incense. A small fire crackled softly in the hearth, but even the warmth of the room couldn't chase the chill that hung over it. Miss Marple made her way to a nearby armchair, sitting down slowly. She surveyed the room with a practiced eye, taking note of the disarray. It wasn't just the garden that had been neglected. The house itself, once orderly and immaculate, now seemed to be crumbling at the edges. "Henry," she began after a long silence, her voice steady, "I know this must be difficult for you. The death of your wife, and now Mrs. Archer. It's enough to strain anyone. But I have to ask, do you know something that the rest of us don't? Something about these murders?" The vicar's shoulders slumped as he sank into the chair opposite her. He was silent for a long while, staring into the fire as though it might offer him some solace. His hands trembled, and Miss Marple could see the torment in his eyes. At last he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "I do know something. I've known for a long time." Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart quickening. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the truth might finally come to light. I never wanted anyone to know," the vicar continued, his words coming out in a rush. "But now, with everything that's happened, I can't keep it to myself any longer." Miss Marple remained silent, watching him closely. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. "The truth is," the vicar said, swallowing hard, "I wasn't always the man you see before you. Before I came to this village, I had a different life, a different name. I was someone else entirely. I used to be a part of something dark and dangerous. And now, because of that, people are dying." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected for some time that there was more to the vicar's past than he let on, but she had never expected this. She leaned forward, her voice calm but insistent. "What do you mean, Henry? What did you do?" The vicar's eyes filled with tears, and he clasped his hands together, his knuckles turning white. "I was involved in a group, an underground society, a secret sect that operated in the shadows. We did things I'm not proud of. I thought I could leave it all behind when I came here, but it seems that my past has caught up with me." Miss Marple's mind raced. She had heard whispers of secret societies before, groups that manipulated and controlled from the shadows, but to hear it from the vicar, of all people, was something she had not anticipated. "Who was in this group?" she asked, her voice steady but urgent. The vicar hesitated, as if he were considering whether to divulge this last piece of information. Finally, he nodded, his face grim. "It was a group of influential people from various walks of life. Politicians, business owners, even some from the church. They were all part of it. And one of them was Mrs. Archer." Miss Marple's eyes widened at this revelation. "Mrs. Archer?" she repeated. "But she was an upstanding woman. What role could she have possibly played in such a group?" The vicar's face twisted with regret. "You don't understand. Mrs. Archer was involved in much more than just charity work. She was a key player in the group. She knew too much. And when she tried to get out, well, that's when things went wrong." "Are you saying that Mrs. Archer's death wasn't a random act?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low. "No," the vicar replied, his voice trembling. "It wasn't random. She was murdered because she tried to expose the group. And now they're after me, after my wife." The vicar's confession hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple could hardly believe what she was hearing. The murders, the mysterious rose, the cryptic messages, it all pointed to something much larger than a simple act of vengeance. This was a conspiracy, a deadly game played by those who thought they could remain above the law. "But why your wife?" Miss Marple asked, trying to make sense of it all. Why was she targeted? The vicar's face twisted in anguish. Because she knew too much. She had found out some things that were better left unknown. She started asking questions, and that's when they decided to silence her. Miss Marple sat back, her mind reeling from the enormity of the revelation. There were powerful forces at play, forces that were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "Who is behind this, Henry?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Who is pulling the strings?" The vicar's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, there was a sharp knock on the door. "Vicar!" a voice called from outside. "It's Constable Hawkes. We need to speak with you immediately." The vicar looked at Miss Marple, his eyes wide with panic. "They've come for me," he whispered. I can't." Miss Marple stood up, her mind sharp with determination. She knew that time was running out, and the answers she sought were within reach. "Stay calm, Henry," Miss Marple said, firmly. "I'll handle this, but you need to tell me everything, and you need to do it quickly." The door swung open, and Constable Hawkes stepped inside. He stopped short when he saw Miss Marple, his face a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "I'm helping the vicar, Constable," Miss Marple replied with a knowing smile. "And I believe it's time you heard the truth." The room was thick with anticipation. It was a moment of reckoning, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of it pressing down on them all. The truth was no longer something to be uncovered. It was now something that had to be fought for. Part 8. The Vicar's Confession. The following day Miss Marple found herself standing at the wrought-iron gate of the vicarage, the very same gate she had passed countless times before. The village was quieter now, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. The murders had cast a long shadow over the community, and though many were too frightened to speak of it, Miss Marple could sense that the villagers were desperate for answers. She, too, was hungry for the truth, but in her mind the truth could only be found through patience, observation, and an understanding of the people who lived in the village. The vicarage itself was a small stone building, its ivy-covered walls standing as a quiet sentinel at the heart of the village. The garden, usually well-maintained, was now untidy. Wild flowers growing unkempt in places where there had once been neat rows. The vicar's unease, it seemed, had translated into neglect of his duties as a caretaker. As Miss Marple walked along the gravel path, her thoughts were filled with the questions that still lingered from her last conversation with Constable Hawkes. Why had the murders followed such a similar pattern? And why were two women who seemed so different tied together by such a brutal act? The door to the vicarage creaked open as she reached it, and there stood Vicar Henry Price, his face pale and drawn, as though he had not slept for days. His eyes darted around, and for a moment he hesitated before greeting her. "Miss Marple," he said in a strained voice, "what brings you here today?" "I've come for a chat, Henry," Miss Marple replied gently, offering him a warm, disarming smile. "I've been thinking a lot about the recent events in the village, and I believe you might have something to tell me." Vicar Price's face tightened at her words, and he quickly looked down, avoiding her gaze. There was a moment of hesitation, and then he stepped aside, opening the door wider to let her in. "Please come in," he muttered. "It's not often I have visitors these days." Inside, the vicarage was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of old books and incense, A small fire crackled softly in the hearth, but even the warmth of the room couldn't chase the chill that hung over it. Miss Marple made her way to a nearby armchair, sitting down slowly. She surveyed the room with a practised eye, taking note of the disarray. It wasn't just the garden that had been neglected. The house itself, once orderly and immaculate, now seemed to be crumbling at the edges. "Henry," she began after a long silence, her voice steady, "I know this must be difficult for you, the death of your wife, and now Mrs. Archer. It's enough to strain anyone, but I have to ask, do you know something that the rest of us don't? Something about these murders?" The vicar's shoulders slumped as he sank into the chair opposite her. He was silent for a long while, staring into the fire as though it might offer him some solace. His hands trembled, and Miss Marple could see the torment in his eyes. At last he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "I do know something. I've known for a long time." Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart quickening. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the truth might finally come to light. I never wanted anyone to know," the vicar continued, his words coming out in a rush. "But now, with everything that's happened, I can't keep it to myself any longer." Miss Marple remained silent, watching him closely. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. "The truth is," the vicar said, swallowing hard, "I wasn't always the man you see before you. Before I came to this village, I had a different life, a different name. I was someone else entirely. I used to be a part of something dark and dangerous. And now, because of that, people are dying." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected for some time that there was more to the vicar's past than he let on, but she had never expected this. She leaned forward, her voice calm but insistent. "What do you mean, Henry? What did you do?" The vicar's eyes filled with tears, and he clasped his hands together, his knuckles turning white. "I was involved in a group, an underground society, a secret sect that operated in the shadows. We did things I'm not proud of. I thought I could leave it all behind when I came here, but it seems that my past has caught up with me." Miss Marple's mind raced. She had heard whispers of secret societies before, groups that manipulated and controlled from the shadows, but to hear it from the vicar of all people was something she had not anticipated. "Who was in this group?" she asked, her voice steady but urgent. The vicar hesitated, as if he were considering whether to divulge this last piece of information. Finally, he nodded, his face grim. It was a group of influential people from various walks of life. Politicians, business owners, even some from the church. They were all part of it, and one of them was Mrs. Archer. Miss Marple's eyes widened at this revelation. "Mrs. Archer?" she repeated. But she was an upstanding woman. What role could she have possibly played in such a group? The vicar's face twisted with regret. "You don't understand. Mrs. Archer was involved in much more than just charity work. She was a key player in the group. She knew too much. And when she tried to get out, well, that's when things went wrong." "Are you saying that Mrs. Archer's death wasn't a random act?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low. "No, the vicar replied, his voice trembling. "It wasn't random. She was murdered because she tried to expose the group. And now they're after me. After my wife." The vicar's confession hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple could hardly believe what she was hearing. The murders, the mysterious rose, the cryptic messages, it all pointed to something much larger than a simple act of vengeance. This was a conspiracy, a deadly game played by those who thought they could remain above the law. "But why your wife?" Miss Marple asked, trying to make sense of it all. "Why was she targeted?" The vicar's face twisted in anguish. Because she knew too much. She had found out some things that were better left unknown. She started asking questions, and that's when they decided to silence her. Miss Marple sat back, her mind reeling from the enormity of the revelation. There were powerful forces at play, forces that were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "Who is behind this? Henry?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Who is pulling the strings?" The vicar's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, there was a sharp knock on the door. "Vicar!" a voice called from outside. "It's Constable Hawkes. We need to speak with you immediately." The vicar looked at Miss Marple, his eyes wide with panic. "They've come for me," he whispered. I can't." Miss Marple stood up, her mind sharp with determination. She knew that time was running out, and the answers she sought were within reach. "Stay calm, Henry," Miss Marple said, firmly. "I'll handle this, but you need to tell me everything, and you need to do it quickly." The door swung open, and Constable Hawkes stepped inside. He stopped short when he saw Miss Marple, his face a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "I'm helping the vicar, Constable," Miss Marple replied with a knowing smile. "And I believe it's time you heard the truth." The room was thick with anticipation. It was a moment of reckoning, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of it pressing down on them all. The truth was no longer something to be uncovered. It was now something that had to be fought for. "You said Part 9 ChatGPT said..." Part 9. The Final Revelation. The tension in the vicarage was palpable, as Constable Hawkes's gaze shifted between Miss Marple and Vicar Price. The door still stood ajar, and beyond it, the quiet village seemed unaware of the storm that was brewing within these walls. Miss Marple, however, could sense the inevitability of what was to come. She had pieced together enough of the puzzle to know that the pieces were about to snap into place. She only had to ensure that the truth did not slip through her fingers. "Constable," she began, her voice steady and calm, despite the weight of the moment. "There's much you don't know, much that the vicar has been hiding." Hawkes eyed her warily. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? The vicar has been through a great deal already. If this is another one of your games—" "It's no game, Constable," she interrupted, her tone cutting through his scepticism. "The truth about the murders in this village is far more complicated than you imagine. Vicar Price has been running from his past, but that past is now chasing him down, and it has claimed more lives." The constable looked over at the vicar, whose hands had begun trembling again. "What's this about, Henry?" Hawkes demanded, his voice low and commanding. "What has she been talking about?" Vicar Price swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. The weight of his confession was heavy on his shoulders, but he could no longer carry it alone. He took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice cracking. "The murders, the deaths, they're all connected to a secret group I used to be a part of," he said, his words rushing out in a torrent. "A dangerous society. We thought we could escape our past, but the past has come back to haunt us." Constable Hawkes blinked in disbelief. "A secret society? You're telling me that these deaths, Mrs. Archer, your wife, are because of some underground group?" "Yes," the vicar whispered, "but it's not just any group. We were part of something much darker. People with power, influence, people who thought they were untouchable. They used their connections to control everything, and anyone who tried to break free was silenced." Miss Marple observed both men closely, noting the sharpness in Hawkes's eyes, the way he was starting to piece things together. "But why the murders?" Hawkes asked. "Why now?" Vicar Price's gaze dropped, and his voice barely rose above a whisper. "Because one of us, Mrs. Archer, tried to expose the group. She knew too much. She had gathered evidence, information, and when she tried to get out, they killed her. Just like they killed my wife. Just like they will kill me if I don't. Stay hidden." A shocked silence followed the vicar's words. Hawkes took a step back, clearly overwhelmed by what he had just learned. "Who are they, Henry?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes fixed on him, willing him to finish the story. "Who is behind this group?" The vicar hesitated, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might refuse to say. But then he closed his eyes, steeling himself. "It was never just one person," he said softly. "It was a collective, a web of individuals. But the person who orchestrated everything, who pulled the strings, was a man named Charles Moreau." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat at the name. Charles Moreau. She had heard whispers of the man in passing, always rumours, always spoken of in hushed tones. But she had never connected him to the deaths in the village. "He's powerful, Henry," she said, her voice low. "What do you mean by orchestrated? What exactly is his role in this?" The vicar looked haunted. "He was the leader, the one who ran everything from behind the scenes. A businessman, a philanthropist, a man who had built a fortune on lies. And he was the one who made sure no one ever left the group alive. Mrs. Archer, my wife, they were just two of his victims. And now it's my turn." Miss Marple's mind was racing, connecting the dots. Charles Moreau was a man of influence. He had the power to make things disappear, to erase people from the picture entirely. And if Vicar Price's involvement had come to light, if he had been dragged into the web, it made sense that Moreau would go to any length to keep his name clean, no matter who had to die in the process. "Do you think Moreau is still in the village?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing. Vicar Price's gaze was distant, as though he were seeing things beyond the walls of the vicarage. "I don't know. He's always been able to stay one step ahead of the law. But I'm sure he's involved in these murders. I'm sure he has a hand in it all." "Then we need to stop him," Miss Marple said firmly, "before anyone else dies." Hawkes shifted uneasily, clearly wrestling with the enormity of the situation. "And how do you suggest we do that?" Miss Marple stood up, her mind already calculating the next steps. "We'll have to confront him. We need to gather evidence. We can't just accuse him without proof." "And how do you propose we do that?" Hawkes asked, his tone sceptical. Miss Marple's lips curled into a small smile. "You, Constable, will have to trust me." Hours later, Miss Marple and Constable Hawkes stood in the darkened study of the vicarage. The fire was now reduced to embers, casting a faint glow on the room's cluttered shelves. Vicar Price had gone silent, a shell of the man who had confessed earlier. Miss Marple, however, was a woman of action. The pieces were in place, but they needed to catch Moreau in the act. "We need a plan," Miss Marple said to Hawkes, her voice sharp. "We can't let him slip away again." The constable nodded slowly. "I agree, but how do we get him to make a mistake?" Miss Marple smiled, the spark of her old brilliance returning. "We set a trap, Constable, a carefully crafted trap, and Charles Moreau won't even see it coming." The next evening, under the cover of twilight, Miss Marple, Hawkes, and a few trusted officers set their plan in motion. They knew that Moreau would be making his move soon. He always did when a loose end needed to be tied up. Miss Marple's trap was simple, yet effective. They would use the vicar as bait, knowing that Moreau would likely come to silence him once and for all. The sound of tyres crunching on the gravel path reached Miss Marple's ears. Her heart quickened. In anticipation, this was it. Charles Moreau was coming. Part 10. The Final Confrontation. The moon hung low over the village, casting long, eerie shadows across the quiet streets. The trap had been set, and now all they had to do was wait. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the vicarage garden, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The chill of the night air did little to faze her. Her mind was focused on the task at hand. This was the moment she had been anticipating. The culmination of weeks of subtle investigation, piecing together bits of a puzzle that no one else had been able to solve. Behind her, Constable Hawkes was pacing back and forth in the study, his unease palpable. "What if he doesn't show up, Miss Marple?" he asked for the third time. "What if we're wrong?" Miss Marple turned slightly, her expression unwavering. "Trust me, Constable, he'll come. They always do when they're cornered." Hawkes gave a sharp nod, his hands still twitching at his sides. He was out of his depth, but Miss Marple's unshakable confidence gave him a measure of reassurance. Moments passed in tense silence. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. The air was thick with anticipation. Then, in the distance, the unmistakable hum of an engine cut through the night. Hawkes stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "That's him," he murmured. Miss Marple held up a hand, signalling him to remain silent. She stepped closer to the garden gate, peering through the dark, watching as headlights appeared around the bend. In the road, the vehicle was approaching. The constable tensed. "Should we make a move now?" he whispered urgently. "No," Miss Marple replied with quiet authority. "We wait. We let him make the first move. He has no idea we know about him." The car pulled to a stop in front of the vicarage. The engine sputtered to silence, and for a moment everything seemed still. Then the door of the car opened, and a tall figure stepped out. He was wearing a dark suit, his face partially obscured by the brim of a fedora. The man's gait was deliberate, confident, almost casual, as though he didn't fear the night or its shadows. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. This was the man who had orchestrated everything. Charles Moreau. "Stay here," she whispered to Hawkes. "Let me handle this." She moved swiftly, stepping out from the shadows and walking towards the vicarage's front steps. As she approached, she could see Moreau's eyes flicker toward her, his expression unreadable. He had clearly not expected her to be here, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a thin, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. "Well, well," Moreau said, his voice low and smooth. "It's been a long time, Miss Marple." "You're a hard man to catch, Mr. Moreau," she replied, keeping her tone even, her gaze never leaving his. "But even the cleverest criminals slip up eventually." He chuckled, his smile widening. "I must admit, I'm impressed. Not many have managed to uncover the truth. But I imagine that's your specialty, isn't it?" Miss Marple didn't respond right away. She was watching him carefully, noting the slight twitch in his hand as he adjusted the collar of his jacket. The trap was working. He was growing agitated. "I've known for a while now, Mr. Moreau," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've known about the group, about your role in it, and about your involvement in these murders. Mrs. Archer, the vicar's wife, they were just collateral damage in your web of deceit." Moreau's smile faltered for a brief moment, but it quickly returned, colder and more calculating than before. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long, Miss Marple," he said, his voice now tinged with menace. "You think you can stop me? You think you can expose me?" "I think I've already exposed you," Miss Marple said quietly, her gaze sharp. "The constable has enough evidence to arrest you now, Charles. It's over." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Moreau's face. His posture stiffened, his eyes darting around as though considering his options. Then he took a step back, his lips curling into a tight, thin line. "You think you've won, don't you?" he sneered. "But you've underestimated me. I'm always 3 steps ahead." Suddenly, with a swift motion, he reached into his coat, pulling out a small, glinting object. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. A gun! Without hesitation, she darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the shot that rang out into the quiet night. The sound echoed through the village, sharp and jarring. "Drop it, Moreau!" Hawkes shouted from the shadows, his voice urgent. Moreau froze, the gun still in his hand, but now the flicker of panic was unmistakable. "You think you can stop me?" he repeated, but this time there was a tremor in his voice. "Step away from the gun," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and steady. "You're finished. There's nowhere to run." For a long moment Moreau stood motionless, as if weighing his options. Then, with a bitter laugh, he let the gun fall to the ground, its metallic clink echoing in the night. "I should have known," he muttered, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I should have known it would end like this." Miss Marple moved forward, her eyes never leaving his. "It's over, Charles. You'll be held accountable for what you've done." As the constable stepped forward, handcuffs in hand, Moreau didn't resist. He seemed strangely resigned, as though he had known all along that this moment was inevitable. Later, in the vicarage study, the village had finally returned to a sense of calm. The storm had passed, and the truth had been brought to light. The bodies of those lost to Moreau's cruelty had been avenged. Constable Hawkes, though still shaken, stood beside Miss Marple as they looked over the final pieces of evidence. "Do you think there are others out there?" Hawkes asked, his voice filled with doubt. Miss Marple shook her head. "For now, the danger is over. But like all things, the past will linger in the shadows. There are always remnants, always those who would prefer their secrets remain buried." Hawkes nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with the weight of the events. "And what about the vicar?" he asked. "What happens to him?" Miss Marple sighed, her eyes thoughtful. "He'll have to answer for his part in this, but I suspect his guilt will weigh heavier than any prison sentence. Some crimes are too terrible to truly escape." With that, Miss Marple turned and walked toward the door, her steps light but purposeful. She had solved the case. Justice had been served, but, as always, she knew that in the quietest corners of life, the shadows would continue to stir.